The world of Remnant is one plagued by monsters, so in honor of the spooky season, as well as today being the birthday of one Miss Ruby Rose, I think it's about time that we catalog all of the Grimm that we have encountered throughout the course of the RWBY series thus far, what their general abilities are, and where they can be found throughout the world of Remnant. So in this video, we will be doing just that, organizing and cataloging the Grimm based on where they can be found throughout Remnant and giving a general idea of what their abilities actually are. So we'll start off with the Grimm found in the kingdom where the RWBY series began, the Kingdom of Vale, and starting with the Grimm that was first introduced into the RWBY series way back in the Red trailer. I'm of course talking about the Beowulf. And although the Beowulf has gone through a number of redesigns throughout the RWBY series, its general attack patterns remain the same, relying on its claws and fangs to attack opponents, as well as operating in more of a pack mentality, moving as a group more so than a single unit, so if a huntsman or huntress is trapped with an entire pack of Beowulfs, they could be in a little bit of trouble. Although a single Beowulf isn't really much of a threat to a trained huntsman or huntress, a group of them certainly can be. There's also an alpha variant of the Beowulf that can be a lot more deadly. An alpha variant being one that has lived longer than normal Grimm, has had time to grow stronger and add more bone plating and spikes to itself, as well as be much stronger in general, and more of a handful to deal with. We saw one of these in Volume 3 for the Beowulf, and this Grimm is one of the few that has also been shown to have a mutant variant in the RWBY Grimm Eclipse game. Though this hasn't been actually introduced into the RWBY series proper itself, a mutant variant of the Beowulf does exist. And although the Beowulf was introduced in Volume 1 and is found throughout the Kingdom of Vale, it can also be found in other kingdoms across Remnant. We have seen it appear in the Kingdom of Mistral, and most recently we have seen the Ice variant of the Beowulf appear in Atlas, and likely we might see this appear in Volume 8 and further beyond. We have not seen this appear in Vacuo or Menagerie as of yet, but it is possible that this Grimm could exist there. The next Grimm on this list is the Ursa, that was also introduced in Volume 1 of the RWBY series in the Kingdom of Vale. And so far this one has not been seen in the Kingdom of Mistral, but has been seen as an Ice variant in the Kingdom of Atlas. This Grimm relies again on its claws and its teeth to attack, but also relies on its overwhelming presence. It is much larger than a Beowulf and can be a little difficult for huntsmen and huntresses to keep up with. Now, it has been shown that huntsmen and huntresses in training are capable of taking out Ursa on their own, but if they become outnumbered, they would get overwhelmed a lot more quickly, in theory, than they would against a pack of Beowulfs. There is also an alpha variant of the Ursa that exists that was actually taken down by Jean in Volume 1. Although this one is referred to as an Ursa Major, befitting the name, it's still an alpha variant of an Ursa, and, you know, a terrifying foe for most people to come up against. Hence why the majority, or all of Team Cardinal took off. It's just Cardin was attracting the Ursa at the time thanks to the sap that was on him, so wasn't able to escape. But Jean to the rescue, and he was able to take it out. And although it was included in the RWBY Grimm Eclipse game, it has not been shown to have a mutant variant, unlike our next one on this list, which is the Death Stalker. This Grimm was one of the more boss-style Grimm in Volume 1 of the RWBY series, a difficult Grimm for the students at the time just starting out at the Huntsman Academies to deal with. This Grimm relies on its claws and its stinger to attack, and its hulking size as well as plate armor, the bone plates that most Grimm have, the Deathstalker has covering a majority of its backside, making it difficult for huntsmen and huntresses to pierce it and ultimately kill it. This one was difficult for all of the students to deal with, but Team Juniper was able to take it down, and this one, as I mentioned, has a mutant variant and also a baby variant, neither of which have been introduced into the RWBY series proper, the mutant variant appearing in the Grimm Eclipse game and the baby variant appearing in the RWBY Amity Arena game. They can be quite deadly if appearing in a swarm. So far, this Grimm has only appeared in the Kingdom of Vale and in the neighboring Kingdom of Vacuo, appearing in the desert as well. So it's possible that this could exist in the deserts of Menagerie on top of that, but has not appeared in Mistral or Atlas as of yet. Wouldn't really think a Scorpion-style Grimm would survive in the snow, so we likely will not see it there. But one Grimm we have seen in both Vale and Atlas is the Nevermoor. The Nevermoor was another boss-style Grimm for Volume 1 of the RWBY series and our huntsmen and huntresses in training. Though now it is not really considered a boss-style Grimm, it was a threat at the time, thanks to its hulking size and because of its hulking size and ability to fly, that allows it to use its beak and its bone-plated head to give some pretty devastating charged attacks. Not to mention, it can also use its feathers as projectiles. I would say needle-like projectiles, but given their size, they're more like spears, as they can be flung towards opponents on the ground or even in the air and simply pierce into them. It was used to pin RWBY in place and allowed the Deathstalker to attack her, so it can be a very difficult opponent to come up against and requires a little bit of skill or teamwork to be able to take it down. We saw Maria Calavera deal with one by herself, thanks to her Silver Eyes and her Weapons of Life and Death back in Volume 6, so this Grimm is definitely one that is to be considered a threat, and appears not only in the Kingdom of Vale, but in the Kingdom of Mistral as well. We saw this in the flashback for Ren's backstory, and we have recently seen it in Atlas in an ice variant. There are also baby Nevermoors that have appeared in the RWBY series. They are referred to as Nevermoor chicks, and we have seen them back in Volume 2, or even Volume 1. Remember that little bird that RWBY crashed into? That was a Nevermoor chick, as well as those that were shot out of the sky by Blake in Volume 2 when they were out on the mission, researching the settlement of Mountain Glen. And another Grimm that appeared in Mountain Glen was one of the more odd Grimm in the RWBY series, not necessarily based on a given animal, but this one is the Creep. It is a bipedal Grimm that relies mostly on charging attacks, bites, and tail swiping, and so far we have only seen this Grimm in the Kingdom of Vale. And the Creep does have a mutant variant that appeared in the RWBY Grimm Eclipse game. Since this Grimm has only been found in the Kingdom of Vale thus far, it's unknown if we ever will see it again in the RWBY series, but it's certainly possible when we return to Beacon. The next Grimm that we have to cover is the King Taiji. This is one that was introduced in the Emerald Forest as well, that Ren went up against, the two-headed snake. This one relies mostly on its fangs and its lunging capabilities, as well as constricting its opponents. Now, although it hasn't really been shown that much in the RWBY series, outside of the Emerald Forest, it hasn't really been that much of a threat. It has appeared in the RWBY After the Fall novels, as well as the Deathstalkers, as a Grimm that resides in Vacuo. So, alongside the Deathstalkers, both of these Grimm have only been shown to be on the continent that contains both Vale and Vacuo, and has not been seen in any other kingdom as of yet. Although the King Taiji doesn't have an alpha variant shown in the RWBY series as of yet, there is one variation shown in the RWBY unofficial manga that combines 4 of them together to create the 8-headed serpent, Yamata no Orochi type inspired Grimm, that Team RWBY and Team Juniper had to team up to deal with and would be quite terrifying to come up against. This was inspired by another unofficial Grimm, the octopus tentacle style Grimm that can possess living things and fuse them together. So in theory, if this unofficial Grimm combined with humans and Grimm, it could fuse them together, but we have no idea if we will ever see that in the RWBY series, or if something inspired by it potentially maybe might come about later. So with that being said, we will move on from the King Taiji to another Grimm that was introduced in Volume 1, the Borba Tusk. This one has only been seen in the Kingdom of Vale thus far, of course not counting Weiss's summons, where she summoned a Borba Tusk both in Atlas and in Mistral. The Grimm naturally has only been found in Vale. And this one uses more charging attacks, using its tusks as well as its ability to roll towards opponents, making it very difficult for opponents to counterattack against it. Its bone plating, when it rolls into a ball, makes it very difficult to pinpoint its weaknesses, those being more on its stomach, so you have to knock it on its back to be able to deal a death blow, as Weiss did back in Volume 1. Hopefully we will see the Borba Tusk again soon. Likely, though, we will only see it when we return to Beacon Academy. It might exist in Mistral, but so far it's only existed in the Kingdom of Vale. Next we have the Griffin. So far, this Grimm has only been shown in the Kingdom of Vale, within the first 3 volumes of the RWBY series, relying on its beak and talons to attack opponents, as well as its ability to fly. Though if a Griffin is large enough, it has been known to swallow people whole, as a Griffin did to Roman Torchwick near the end of Volume 3. Though the Griffin survived the ship crash, and I fully believe that Roman Torchwick survived as well. But so far, this Grimm only exists within the Kingdom of Vale, as does the next Grimm on this list, the Goliath, the African elephant-inspired Grimm that seems to just trample everything in its wake. We have not seen a Goliath fight in the RWBY series as of yet, but we did get a little glimpse into its power in RWBY After the Fall and Team Coffee's mission to lure Cairn, that, ended pretty disastrously, because that mission did not go well. I'll leave a link up to a video there if you guys want to go and check that out, because it didn't go well. Like, Goliath killed a lot of people. But considering it has its tusks and trunk, it could probably use that to swing at opponents and deal damage that way. It does have a relative of sorts in Atlas in the form of the Megaliath that is inspired by the Mammoth and has very similar characteristics, and has dealt a lot of damage in Atlas back in Volume 7 as well, but we will touch on the Megaliath in a little while. And now we get to the last Grimm that we have seen in the Kingdom of Vale. That being, of course, the biggest Grimm we have seen in Vale, the Wyvern. That has the ability to spawn other Grimm. This one is in a bit of a special category, as it was seen hibernating in a mountain and was only awakened due to a mass amount of panic, so it could be a special class of Grimm that exists only in certain areas when a grouping of Grimm hibernates for a long while and combines together, or something of that sort, possibly being planted by Salem for this attack. We're not exactly sure how the Wyvern came about. So far, it's only been seen that one time in the RWBY series, and currently rests atop Beacon Tower, but it certainly has a lot of strength, not only with its capability to summon other Grimm, but also just using its flight to charge and destroy entire towers and buildings. It would likely also be able to claw at people using its claws, though being a Wyvern it doesn't have actual hands, but it could use the talons of its feet and also its fangs to swallow people whole as well. A very powerful Grimm, and we might see it awakened at some point in the RWBY series once we get back to Beacon, but we will have to wait and see for that to happen. There are a couple of other Grimm that are unofficial that were included in the RWBY manga anthologies that I feel I should mention here. We don't know their exact abilities, but we have seen the Drake, the Berserker, and a Spider Grimm. The Spider Grimm is the only one that we have any real unique abilities for, as it can cause illusions, and caused Blake to fight a copy of herself during those anthologies. So these might be Grimm that might be introduced later on, though they may remain non-canon, still worth mentioning here. Next we move on to the Kingdom of Mistral, and the first new Grimm that we were introduced to when we got to Mistral was the Barangal, the giant ape-like Grimm that have a lot of strength, normally relying on just their fists and their ability to slam opponents as their main fighting capabilities. They are very tough Grimm to beat, and in the red trailer for Volume 4, RWBY fought one solo, which was quite difficult for her to do, and she had to get a lot of momentum to be able to pierce its massive armor. So far, we've only seen Barangals naturally appear in Mistral. We have seen them at the end of Volume 6 when Salem was giving them wings, and they are currently flying alongside the Grimm Whale as part of Salem's army. But naturally occurring, they are only in the Kingdom of Mistral thus far, and technically, I guess this is a good point to mention this, all Grimm could likely occur naturally from the black pools next to Salem's Citadel, not to mention Salem could create them from the black pools herself, but we're more focusing on where they exist naturally throughout the world of Remnant, where they decide to settle after being born from the black pools or wherever else they would come from. So now we'll move on to the next Grimm on this list, one that was introduced at the beginning of Volume 4, the Geist Grimm, and a Grimm that plays a continuous role throughout the RWBY series. This one is a possession-style Grimm, able to possess objects around it to form either the Petragigas that we have seen at the beginning of Volume 4, where it possesses rocks, trees, etc., and forms a hulking body, or even the Arma-Gigas, where it can possess a giant suit of armor that we saw all the way back in the White trailer. The Geist, as far as we've seen, exists in the Kingdom of Mistral and the Kingdom of Atlas, though it is very likely the Geist can be found in the Kingdom of Vale as well, considering that the Petragigas fight that we saw at the beginning of Volume 4 was initially planned for the Emerald Forest initiation at the beginning of Volume 1. Not to mention, Geist has also been shown in the RWBY Chibi that features Beacon Academy, so it's very likely that the Geist exists in Vale as well as Mistral and Atlas, and possibly even Vacuo once we get there if Geists exist there, though not much to possess out in the desert, so maybe not that much hope of that happening. And then we move on to the Lancers that were introduced at the beginning of Volume 5. The Hornets from Hell, or Wasps, or whatever, stinging monstrosity they are based on, they operate in a swarm mentality, and if you are flying through the skies and happen to be swarmed by them, good luck, because they rely on their stingers that they can shoot out as projectiles and grapple onto things, as well as also also ramming ships that come by them and can be quite difficult to deal with. The Lancers have a larger form as well, though it's not necessarily an alpha variant brought on by the Lancers living longer and growing stronger. It seems that it is more the commander of the swarm, hence the name the Queen Lancer. This is a Lancer that is much larger, stronger, and bulkier, able to deal a lot more damage and take a lot more hits. So, you know, any ship that flies by, if they encounter one and don't have a trained huntsman or huntress on board, their ship is probably going down. Definitely one that you don't want to come across when flying through the skies of Mistral. But on Mistral, there are some scarier Grimm to come across, as is our next one on the list, the Knuckle Lavi. This is the boss-style Grimm that was at the end of Volume 4 of the RWBY series, and is quite unique in also its appearance as well as its actual form, as it is the only Grimm we have seen in the RWBY series thus far that is a combination of two separate Grimm. The Horse Grimm and the Imp Grimm that has been riding it. And its abilities that we have seen in the RWBY series thus far consist mostly of the Imp Grimm stretching out its arms, swinging that around, trapping opponents, and trying to spear them with its arms, as well as the deafening roar or screech that it has that can kind of disorient opponents for a short time. In theory, though, the Horse-style Grimm would be able to trample opponents, charge them, and also bite with its fangs, so it might have more capabilities than we saw at the end of Volume 4. Still a very terrifying Grimm to come across, and it's very difficult to get close with the style of attacks that it has, but Team Ranger was able to take it down through a lot of effort. So far, the Knuckle Lavi has only been seen in the Kingdom of Mistral, as is the same with the Lancers, so it's unclear if we will see them elsewhere. The Knuckle Lavi might be a more unique style of Grimm, even more so than the Wyvern, where it would take some unique circumstances to either combine these two Grimm together, and frankly, since we haven't seen either of these two Grimm separately in the RWBY series, it's unclear how they became merged or where either of them would be located beforehand. Perhaps this Grimm was placed by someone else, or through the use of magic or something like that. There is a bit of an unknown history with the Knuckle Lavi. Moving on, though, to the other Grimm that have been introduced in the Kingdom of Mistral, we have the manticores. These are the Grimm that attacked the Argus Limited at the beginning of Volume 6. They have their flight as well as their claws and fangs, and can also shoot fireballs from their mouths as well. Very dangerous to come across, and seem to operate in a more of a pack mentality as well that is led by the Sphinx Grimm. This Grimm is a kind of larger version of the manticore, though also unique and different, as it has a snake tail that can also attack. It is larger in size and can just straight up breathe fire rather than just, you know, little fireballs. So very dangerous Grimm to come across in any of these, and both of them have been seen not only in the Kingdom of Mistral, but in the Kingdom of Atlas as well. Now, throughout Volume 7, we have seen the Ice Manticores, and at the end of Volume 7, flying alongside Salem's army, we saw Ice Sphinxes. So it's kind of unclear whether the Ice Sphinx itself could be found naturally in the Kingdom of Atlas, but I would assume that since the Manticores can, the Sphinx could as well, and it flying alongside Salem's army in its ice variation kind of indicates as such. And then we get to the last new Grimm in Mistral that has been shown in the RWBY series itself, and probably the most terrifying Grimm of all, the Apathy. This Grimm has the ability to drain a person's willpower, as well as a screech that can weaken an opponent and drop them to their knees. On their own, not much of a threat, but when they gather in a swarm, it's very difficult for anyone to actually go up against them. And Team RWBY was only able to win because of Ruby's Silver Eyes, and they weren't even able to kill them all. They ended up running away. So the Apathy are definitely a plague upon the Kingdom of Mistral, and we'll see if we ever see them in the RWBY series again. So far, we've only seen them in Mistral, and for the sake of everyone else in the series, hopefully they stay there, because they are a terrifying opponent to come up against. There are a few other Grimm in Mistral that have been named, just haven't appeared in the RWBY series as of yet. These were introduced in the RWBY Fairy Tales of Remnant in The Hunter's Children. They are the Largardiles, the Grendels, the Poisonous Longtongues, and the Wisps. We aren't really given much of a description of them, just that they exist within the swamps of Mistral, so we'll see if we ever see those in the RWBY series. There are 2 other Grimm that were introduced in the Fairy Tales of Remnant series that likely exist either in Vale or in Mistral, based on where we saw them or where they were introduced in these fairy tales. There was an Owl Grimm that was introduced in The Warrior in the Woods that was pretty much just an Owl Grimm that attacked the main protagonist of that story, and it was difficult for him to deal with because he was a young boy and hadn't really had much training at that time. But since it appeared in a forest setting, it likely was either in Vale or in Mistral, because Atlas, being as cold as it is, not really many forests, Vacuo is a desert, so likely in either Vale or Mistral. And the same can be said for the Grimm that was the focus of the story, the Grimm Child. The Grimm known as the Chill, which is a very real Grimm in the RWBY series. The Owl Grimm we're not exactly sure on, but the Chill is absolutely terrifying in the context of this story. It can possess humans and relies on the inability of people to kill their allies to use that human's body to not only kill others, but also hop possessions as well. In the Grimm Child, its powers were a bit over-exaggerated in that a single chill was able to wipe out an entire settlement at once, but still, the powers of the chill able to take over a person's body, and seemingly that person can't do anything about it, and needs to rely on their allies to kill them to be able to kill the chill. It's a very terrifying Grimm to come across. Now, before we get to the Grimm that appear in the Kingdom of Atlas, there's one more category of Grimm that I want to go over. The Grimm that appear between kingdoms. As I was going over the Grimm that appeared in the Kingdom of Mistral, I'm sure there were a couple exceptions that people may have taken note of, those being the Sea Fei Long and the Leviathan. Technically, these Grimm do not appear in any one given kingdom. They appear in the seas between the kingdoms. Both of these Grimm are extremely powerful and terrifying in their own rights, as they appearing seemingly out of nowhere in the middle of the sea can pose great problems for ships that are trying to get from kingdom to kingdom. Probably flying is the best route to take, though then you have to deal with Lancers, and from the sea you have to deal with Sea Fei Longs, Leviathan, and probably a number of other Grimm that would exist within the sea. But for now we just have these 2. The Sea Fei Long, based on the Chinese dragon, is one that can also fly on top of everything else. So seemingly, whether you're taking a boat or flying, you're still in danger from this one Grimm. This one can breathe lightning, is known to ram ships, and use gusts from its wings to disorient opponents as well. So yeah, very difficult to take out, and took a blast from headlong on the cannon to be able to kill this thing. The Leviathan, appearing at the end of Volume 6 from the sea, was able to break through 2 hard light dust barriers and breathe fire that trailed all the way across the city of Argus, destroying things seemingly a couple kilometers away from it, or at least a kilometer or 2, so this thing has a lot of firepower, and took a lot to be able to take it down. Relying a bit on, RWBY's Silver Eyes, but also the giant Gurren Lagann drill of the Atlas military's giant mech. So this thing is very terrifying, as well as the Sea Fei Long, and possibly when we are moving from Atlas to Vacuo, we might see some other seafaring Grimm at that time. But for now, these are the only 2 Grimm that we know of that appear between the kingdoms. And then we get to the Grimm contained within the Kingdom of Atlas. It's very likely that each of the new Grimm introduced here are exclusive to Atlas, as many of them are based on prehistoric creatures, and with Atlas following that theme, it's unlikely that they will appear elsewhere. We'll start off with the Grimm that was introduced in Episode 1 of Volume 7, the Saber Grimm, that are based on the saber-toothed tiger. They seem to operate in a pack mentality similar to the Beowulfs, and they use their claws and their large fangs to attack opponents. So when they are roaming the streets of Mantle, it's pretty dangerous for those living on the ground. Those up in Atlas, though, don't really have to worry about that very much. We were also introduced very soon in Volume 7 to the Sentinel Grimm. These are insectoid centipede-style Grimm that can burrow through the ground and seem to have pretty great numbers in the mines of Vacuo. So it's not only dangerous for the miners because of the dust that is very reactive, but also because there's Grimm that could just burrow underground and start taking out the miners that way. This Grimm seems to rely on biting and ensnaring opponents using its bodies as well, though we didn't really get to see many of its attacks in motion, as they were pretty much fodder for the Aesops and Team RWBY to display their new weapons and fighting capabilities. The Ice Petragigas being the more boss style of that chapter, and the Aesops were able to take care of that as well. And then near the end of Volume 7, we had the Terex introduced, a dinosaur-inspired Grimm that seems to be a smaller version almost of the Wyvern, at least in my mind. And being a smaller version means it's a little bit more ferocious, able to latch on to smaller ships, use its claws and its fangs to bite at opponents, as well as just having aerial attacks in general and sweeping up people out of the way. It can be a pretty dangerous Grimm to come across in swarms, as many of them are. And speaking of swarms, there's one swarm you definitely don't want to run into, and that is a swarm of megalithics. Though I guess in this one it would be more referred to as a herd of megalithics, as they are based on the mammoths, and they, of course, related to the Goliaths, can trample pretty much anything in their wake. We did see an alpha variation of the Megalith in Volume 7 as well that was very difficult for our protagonists to take care of. The Megalith not only tramples its opponents, but can charge them with its tusks and start sweeping things out of the way using that. So it, yeah, you just don't want to run across Megaliths or Goliaths for that matter, as they will just trample you in their wake, and a single huntsman or huntress, I would find it very difficult for anyone of any skill level to be able to deal with those things, as they can have a lot of power behind them and can take a lot of hits. The last Grimm that I am including in the Atlas category is the Grimm set to be introduced in Volume 8, the winner of the Full Sail Design contest, the Sulfur Fish. This is one that operates on a swarm mentality for sure, being based on an insect, and when it can combine together with other members of its species, becomes something much more deadly and terrifying. It is used to swarming opponents, and apparently has the ability to superheat itself as well, which is probably why it can actually survive in the cold environment of Atlas. Otherwise, I wouldn't really think an insect-style Grimm, other than the Sentinels that can survive underground, would really be that frequent in the Kingdom of Atlas. But I'm looking forward to seeing how it's utilized in Volume 8 and what other Grimm will be introduced in Volume 8 in general, as we will likely see at least one or two more, including an alpha variation of the Sentinel, most likely, at least according to the Volume 7 DVD commentary. And now we move to the last kingdom on Remnant, the Kingdom of Vacuo, largely covered in desert, and although we know that a few of the Grimm we've gone over on this list already do appear in Vacuo, there are some Vacuan-specific Grimm that only appear in Vacuo thus far in the RWBY series. The first of which are the Ravagers. These are bat-like Grimm that are kind of similar to Nevermoors, except a bit smaller and fiercer. These ones rely on clawing and biting at opponents and appear in greater numbers than the Nevermoor do, so they can be quite tricky to deal with, and were introduced in RWBY After the Fall, as was the more boss-style Grimm being the Blind Worm. This is one that has a head on both ends of it and is large enough to jump like 100 feet out of the sand. It burrows under it, can swallow people whole, has acidic spit and blood, and is just a very deadly one to come across when you're roaming around the desert, especially considering it can just come up and swallow you whole from underneath the sand. And it did just that to Coco Adele during the events of After the Fall. So, yeah, definitely don't want to come across this Grimm in Vacuo either. But there are a couple other Grimm in Vacuo that we don't actually have pictures and images for. We'll probably see them once we get to Vacuo, perhaps, but for now, we know their names and a bit of their abilities. The first of which is the Dromedon. These are camel-like Grimm that spit acid as well. Acid seems to be a bit of a common theme in Vacuo, and seems to have an armored hump that can be deflated if hit hard enough, as Yatsuhashi did, I believe, in After the Fall, so even camels are dangerous in Remnant, as well as rabbits, as the next Grimm we have is the Jackalope. This is a large black rabbit that has antlers, so when it uses its hind legs to launch itself forward, the antlers can simply impale their opponents. So every animal is deadly, and some unique animals are appearing in the deserts of Vacuo. The last Grimm that we have from Vacuo, though, is the Giraffe. This is obviously based based on the giraffe, said to be 5 stories tall and has 3 heads, each of which has a long tongue that it can use to ensnare people and swallow them whole. So Vacuo is just a deadly place. Not only are there a whole bunch of unique Grimm that want to kill you, there's also the wildlife itself that wants to kill you. So yeah, Vacuo is just a very inhospitable place, and it's amazing that people can survive there in just nomadic tribes in general, with all of these monsters roaming around. So these are all of the Grimms that are found in each of the 4 main kingdoms of the RWBY series. There is one Grimm that seems to be on the island of Menagerie that was included in the RWBY comics themselves, a 3-headed dinosaur-inspired Grimm as well that was taken out by Blake and Son. We don't really know anything about it, don't have a name, but supposedly this one could be unique to Menagerie. But the last class of Grimm that I have to go over here is what I call the special type Grimm. These are ones seemingly created only by Salem and aren't adherent to any naturally occurring place in Remnant. They don't appear in any of the kingdoms or anything like that. The first of which is the Beetle Grimm, that Cinder used to steal some of the maiden powers from Amber initially. It was contained within a glove that Cinder put on and was able to spit out some sort of webbing that siphoned power from Amber. At which point, once the webbing was severed, the glove kind of disappeared into Cinder's body and a mark appeared on her back. So it did some physical alteration to Cinder's body and has the power to siphon power. And then this ability also seems to be possessed by the Shadow Hand that Cinder has now as permanently part of her body. It has the ability to stretch itself out, has the claws that can use to attack opponents, and when latching on to someone with magical capabilities, such as another maiden, it can siphon that power away as well. But this Shadow Hand isn't exclusive to Cinder. Salem can summon it at will. She used this against Hazel in Volume 6, so Salem has the abilities to control these Shadow Hands, and it seems to be something unique to Salem, as they aren't really, living things on their own. It's created from magic and I guess maintained by magic or by Cinder, or somehow leeching off of her nutrients as well, like some things like that. Then, of course, we have the Seer Grimm, one that seems to be a unique creation of Salem for monitoring the world and communicating with her allies, or should I say underlings, around Remnant to make sure that her will is being carried out. We first saw this introduced in Volume 4, and we saw how deadly it could be in Volume 5 when Leonardo Lionheart decided to go against Salem's wishes. The orb itself has tentacles hanging from it that can be used to strangle opponents, as well as, in the case of Leo, stab them to death. So the Seer Grimm is fairly strong in its own right, and even when it dies, it can create a black mist that manifests Salem's image, so she can communicate with people almost in person, kind of. She's not physically there, but is still there in a sense. So yeah, the Seer Grimm has some unique capabilities, and I'm pretty sure this one was created by Salem only to fit her needs. As is the very last Grimm that we have to cover, and we don't really know much about this Grimm other than it's the largest one we've ever seen. Of course, the Whale Grimm that was introduced at the end of Volume 7. Curious to see how anyone's going to be able to kill this thing, whether it's from ramming Atlas into it, whether it's from, entering its body, Pinocchio style, and trying to kill it from the inside out, or possibly Silver Eyes, though I doubt that very highly. So we'll see how everything turns out with the Whale Grimm, but this one, as far as we know, has the capability to fly, and probably to ram the entire city of Atlas, maybe help drop it from the sky in that way, shape, or form. So we'll see what the capabilities of the Whale Grimm are, and I look forward to seeing the other Grimm that will be introduced later on in the RWBY series. In Volume 8, 9, and forward. What Grimm is your favorite on this list? What Grimm are you looking forward to seeing more of in the future of RWBY? If we return to Beacon, when we get to Vacuo, in the future of Atlas, just in Volume 8, etc. Let me know down in the comments below. I don't think I missed any Grimm, but if I did miss any of them, make sure to point them out down below as well. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, the cataloging of all of the Grimm that we have seen in the RWBY series thus far from Volumes 1 to 7. So if you guys did enjoy the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button, join the Guild of the Eternal Flame, tweet me at PhoenixKnight7, and I'll see you guys in the next video.